Surf crashes on black lava. Clouds pull light across emerald ridges. Long before Chief of War and Hollywood headlines, Hawaii forged a real kingdom. Voyaging genius, ali'i rule, Kapu law, and blue water diplomacy. How did Kamehameha unite the islands? How did a literate state win treaties with great powers, then face missionaries and sugar? Tonight, we read chants and constitutions, following canoes to courthouses. We'll ask what was lost, what endured, and who gets to tell it. While Chief of War turns history into spectacle, we bring record and voices. Settle in. This is Hawaii's Lost Kingdom, the true history behind Jason Momoa's new show.
The Hawaiian Islands were settled by expert navigators who read the ocean like a map and the night sky like a book. Their canoes carried seeds, stories, and systems of law across thousands of miles, turning remote volcanoes into a connected world. What they built was not a postcard, but a polity, held together by genealogy, custom, and obligations that reached from chiefs to commoners and from mountain to sea. Power lived with the ali'i, bounded by Kapu. Stewardship flowed through the ahupua, ridges to reef, so that water, forests, fields, and fisheries sustained communities in balance. Knowledge was preserved in chant and practice, from the timing of plantings to the routes of birds and currents. This was governance as a living ecology, spiritual, legal, and practical at once. When Western ships arrived in the late 18th century, they brought iron, firearms, and diseases, but also new trade, new beliefs, and new leverage. Alliances shifted as quickly as the price of sandalwood. A rising leader named Kamehameha embraced innovation alongside tradition, reading both tides and tactics. In this crucible, Hawaii moved toward unification, and the world began to take notice. In the 19th century, the kingdom crafted constitutions, sent diplomats, and signed treaties with global powers. Missionaries launched schools, a literate public emerged. Printing presses turned out newspapers in Olelo, Hawaii. Honolulu became a Pacific crossroads where whalers, merchants, and ministers negotiated profit and principle, sometimes in the same afternoon. The kingdom's story is not a tale of isolation cracking under contact, but of selective adoption, assertion, and statecraft. And yet, the currents that carried Hawaii into the modern world also pulled hard: land privatization, plantation capital, strategic interest from abroad. By the century's end, a queen would try to restore royal authority. A coup would overturn it, and annexation would fold the islands into another nation's flag. What was lost is measured, not only in laws and lands, but in language and the right to decide. Today, film and television return to this past, most recently through Chief of War. Drama can open a door, but only the record can light the room. In this documentary, we will follow the sources: chants and letters, constitutions and court cases, petitions and eyewitness narratives. We will listen to Kanaka Maoli voices that span centuries, and we will place legend beside ledger until the outlines sharpen. This is the story of a Pacific kingdom that rose by design, endured by knowledge, and was challenged by forces larger than itself. To understand what Hawaii was and why it still matters, we begin at the beginning, the rise of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
If you're enjoying real history behind the myths, please subscribe and ring the bell. Become a member for early chapters and behind the scenes.
Your support funds maps, sources, and field filming. Visit our shop if you'd like to help us keep sailing. Thank you for keeping this voyage afloat.
Chapter 1. The Rise of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
The story of the Hawaiian Kingdom begins with strategy as much as strength. In the late 18th century, rival chiefs ruled separate islands, forming shifting alliances and testing each other's resolve across narrow channels and long memories. Into this landscape stepped Kamehameha, a leader who read people the way a navigator reads the sea, watching for swells, anticipating turns, and moving first when the current changed. Kamehameha's rise blended tradition with innovation. He cultivated Keōua warriors and expert canoe builders. He honored the gods with heiau and protocol. He forged marriages and alliances that bound power by kinship. At the same time, he adopted foreign technologies when they fit the Hawaiian world. Muskets and cannon did not replace seamanship and courage, but, trained and positioned well, they added reach and shock. Advisors from abroad taught drills and gunnery. Hawaiian crews mastered them quickly. The point was never to imitate a foreign army, it was to augment Hawaiian strengths with any tool that could shorten a battle and save his ali'i and people. Campaigns unfolded island by island. Battles like Moku Ohai, Kepeniwai, and Nu'uanu became milestones not only for their outcomes, but for what they revealed. Logistics over distance, the decisive use of choke points and heights, and the morale-shifting effect of well-sighted artillery. On Oahu, the windward cliffs turned momentum into surrender as forces were pressed toward the precipice. Yet not every victory came from force of arms. Diplomacy, the quiet pressure of envoys and promises kept, brought Kauai and Ni'ihau into the fold, completing a unification that war alone could not secure. Conquest without consolidation is only a pause. Kamehameha's real achievement was to turn victory into governance. He respected the kohale of each district and maintained the chiefly order, but centralized authority where it mattered: control of ports, management of the sandalwood trade, and the collection of resources needed to feed warriors and repair canoes. The traditional ahupua'a system, ridge to reef, continued to shape stewardship, while new royal directives clarified who could harvest what, where, and when. Chiefs expected loyalty, commoners expected protection, the king expected order that allowed ships to dock and taxes to move. Law anchored legitimacy. The Kanawai Mamalahoi, the law of the splintered paddle, proclaimed that non-combatants should be safe on the roads, that farmers and fishers should not be dragged into the violence of chiefs. It was both a moral statement and a practical one. Prosperity depends on people being able to work without fear. Sanctuary traditions at Puʻukoholā endured, even as the state centralized power. Mercy and protection were not signs of weakness, but of a durable realm confident enough to restrain itself. Religion and statecraft remained entwined. Building and dedicating major heiau during this era signaled divine favor and political intent. Priests guarded ritual knowledge, not as decoration, but as a framework for timing campaigns, declaring taboos, and unifying the realm in ceremony. In this synthesis, protocol, logistics, warfare, and worship, the kingdom presented itself as more than a conqueror's prize. It was a lawful order with roots deep enough to hold and flexible enough to adapt. Externally, the world was changing fast. Ships from the Americas and Europe circled the Pacific, hunting whales, seeking ports, and calculating advantage. Kamehameha managed contact with a measured hand, welcoming trade, insisting on respect for Hawaiian authority, and using the flow of goods and knowledge to reinforce his position. Foreigners could advise and barter, they could not rule. Standards were set, infractions punished, and concessions weighed against the long game of sovereignty. By the time Kamehameha's unification was complete, Hawaiʻi had become a singular political actor in the North Pacific. Tribute and loyalty ran through a recognized court. Royal residences and storehouses became centers of redistribution. Decision-making concentrated around a ruler who kept both battle-tested chiefs and seasoned advisors close, translating victory into stability. The kingdom was not yet the treaty-bearing state it would become, but its foundations were laid: a central authority, a controlled economy, a clear legal voice, and a leadership class trained to weigh tradition against the practicalities of a globalizing ocean. The succession plan mattered as much as the first victories. A kingdom built on one exceptional personality risks fading with him. Kamehameha's arrangements for heirs and trusted regents signaled a different intention: continuity. The monarchy would not be a camp that disbanded after the war. It would be a house with rules, roles, and rooms large enough to hold a modernizing future. When foreign captains arrived, they increasingly recognized not a loose collection of islands, but a government with protocols: audiences, permissions, and negotiations handled by people authorized to speak for more than themselves. The rise of the Hawaiian Kingdom, then, is a story of design. It is logistics, law, and legitimacy, woven with chant and ceremony, sharpened by innovation, and secured by leaders who could navigate both the reef and the ledger. With the islands united and the court established, the next chapter turns from steel and stone to paper and ink, from battlefields to boardrooms. Recognition abroad will require more than courage. It will require signatures, seals, and a public that can read them.
Next up, fancy uniforms, foreign ministers, and a kingdom that starts collecting treaties, like shells on a Waikiki morning. Chapter 2. The Golden Age and International Recognition.
Unification gave Hawaii a single voice. The 19th century taught it how to speak that voice in the language of nations. Courts, councils, and ministries took shape, translating chiefly authority into cabinet portfolios and regular procedures. Protocols, audiences, papers, seals, signaled that visitors were meeting a government, not merely a ruler. What began as a coalition around a great chief matured into a constitutional monarchy able to negotiate, legislate, and judge according to published law. Constitutions marked this transformation. Early charters set out the king's powers, established a legislature, and recognized rights for subjects both high and low. Revisions refined the balance: how ministers were appointed, how taxes were levied, how courts handled disputes. The effect was cumulative. Each document told foreign powers that Hawaii could bind itself by rules, and that those rules were legible to the world's chancelleries. Diplomacy traveled by sail, signature, and stamina. Hawaiian envoys crossed oceans to win formal recognition, arguing that the kingdom was a sovereign Pacific state with stable institutions. Letters of credence opened doors. Patient persuasion did the rest. Declarations of recognition followed, and with them a web of treaties on friendship, commerce, and navigation. Consulates appeared in Honolulu and abroad, handling passports, shipping, and the minor crises that prove a flag really flies. Law followed recognition as closely as shadow follows canoe. A high court clarified precedent, and lower courts standardized practice. A land commission translated customary tenure into deeds intelligible to foreign merchants, while trying, imperfectly, to honor older obligations. Jurors heard cases, notaries witnessed contracts, appeals taught litigants why procedure matters. It was not law imported whole, but Hawaiian governance adapted to an ocean-spanning marketplace. Education was the quiet engine of state. Mission schools and royal initiatives produced a literate public that read laws, petitions, and, most importantly, newspapers in Olelo, Hawaii. Printing presses multiplied voices, debates over policy and faith spilled into columns and letters to the editor. Literacy did more than elevate prestige. It created a population capable of participating in a constitutional order and of holding its leaders to published promises. Commerce turned the harbor into a hinge of the Pacific. Whaling ships refitted in season, merchants brokered timber, hides, and later sugar. Harbor rules, customs houses, and a budding postal system kept people and goods accounted for. Revenue financed roads, lighthouses, and public works. Tariffs and tonnage fees underwrote the very institutions that made the port attractive. Foreign captains learned that port calls required compliance, and that compliance brought predictability. Religion and diplomacy intertwined, sometimes uneasily. Missionaries opened schools and printed tracts. Ministers of state drafted dispatches and balanced concessions. The court navigated these crosswinds with a pragmatic keel, welcome the literacy, regulate the zeal, and keep ultimate authority in Hawaiian hands. Royal patronage of education and healthcare coexisted with firm statements of sovereignty, signals to citizens and foreigners alike that Hawaii could both modernize and decide. The Golden Age shone brightest when ceremony met substance. Royal audiences followed precise etiquette, but beneath the choreography lay practical arrangements, custom schedules, quarantine rules, pilotage fees, and the protocols that keep multi-ethnic ports from chaos. Flags, coats of arms, and orders of merit were not mere theater. They were the visual grammar of international life, helping ships, consuls, and courts read the kingdom at a glance. None of this erased vulnerability. Epidemics took a terrible toll. The plantation economy's rise began to concentrate wealth and leverage. Yet the accomplishment remains extraordinary. A Polynesian kingdom, literate and law-governed, securing treaty recognition across two hemispheres and conducting its affairs as a peer among powers far larger than itself. Where others saw a paradise to be visited, Hawaii presented a polity to be respected.
Next, sermons, sugar, and a bayonet no one wants to wear. Chapter 3. Shadows of Empire.
Contact did not arrive as a single ship and depart at dusk. It unpacked trunks and stayed. Missionaries built churches and schools, merchants opened counting houses, planters surveyed valleys for water and cane. Ideas, ledgers, and laws braided into a new order that rewarded capital, demanded labor, and quietly redefined who held leverage in a sovereign Polynesian kingdom. The missionary story is complicated. Many came with genuine religious conviction and helped establish literacy and printing on a wide scale. Hawaiian newspapers became vigorous forums where policy and theology were debated in Olelo, Hawaii. Over time, however, prominent missionary families moved from pulpits to boardrooms, investing in land and sugar and pressing for governance that favored property and predictability. The result was not a simple conquest of faith over culture, but an alliance of conscience and commerce whose priorities often ran ahead of the monarchies. Land was the fulcrum. The 1848 Mahele attempted to translate a web of customary relationships, chiefs, commoners, and the land itself, into categories legible to the modern world: crown lands, government lands, and private holdings. A land commission heard claims. Maps drew lines where reciprocal obligations had once flowed. The Kaʻiana Act that followed allowed commoners to secure small plots in fee simple. Yet the process required surveys, fees, and comfort with paperwork alien to many maka'ainana. In practice, significant acreage consolidated into chiefly estates and increasingly into corporate hands. What law intended as clarity often became the path by which outsiders and the well-capitalized accumulated control. Sugar changed the island's economy, rivers, and politics. Cane demanded flat land, dependable water, mills, and capital. Ditches and flumes rerouted streams, hillsides once terraced for kalo fed rollers and boilers instead. Profits depended on export, and export depended on access to the biggest nearby market. The Reciprocity Treaty of 1875 eased Hawaiian sugar into the United States with reduced duties. A later agreement granted U.S. rights at Pearl Harbor in exchange for continued access. With tariffs tamed and a coaling station rising, the business case brightened, and so did the geopolitical glare. Labor followed the cane. Plantations recruited contract workers across the Pacific and beyond. Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, later Puerto Rican and Filipino laborers, each group carrying languages, foods, and faiths that remade neighborhood soundscapes. Contracts set hours, pay, and penalties. Overseers and courts enforced them. Some laborers found paths to small business and community life. Many endured rigid regimes in fields and company camps. The social mosaic that defines modern Hawaii took shape under plantation whistles, even as the system that created it deepened dependence on foreign markets and laws.
As sugar fortunes swelled, political reformers allied with business interests argued that stability required a tighter rein on royal authority. The 1887 Constitution, nicknamed the Bayonet Constitution for the pressure used to secure it, sharply limited the monarch's power, shifted authority to a cabinet and legislature aligned with the planter elite, and imposed property or income requirements that narrowed the electorate. Native Hawaiians with means continued to vote, but many were squeezed by the new thresholds. Asian residents were largely excluded. Certain foreign residents gained influence disproportionate to their numbers by taking oaths and meeting property tests. The letter of constitutionalism remained, its spirit tilted toward those with capital and connections. Courts and consuls became daily actors in high politics. Disputes over tariffs, leases, and labor contracts poured through a legal system increasingly framed to reassure external investors. Foreign consuls pressed claims for their nationals and signaled the interests of distant capitals. Newspaper wars amplified every crisis, and rumor traveled the waterfront at the speed of canvas and coal. Honolulu's harbor, once a hinge for voyaging canoes and whaling ships, now turned on sugar prices, insurance rates, and the schedules of steamers and warships. Strategic calculations hardened with each treaty and harbor improvement. In the age of coal and cables, Hawaii's location was not merely convenient, it was central. U.S. naval planners flagged the islands as indispensable to Pacific defense and commerce. British and Japanese observers took their own notes. Within this geometry, the kingdom's diplomacy had to thread narrow channels, invite trade without inviting tutelage, assure investors without surrendering control, and modernize without dissolving the cultural and political foundations that made Hawaii Hawaiian. None of this unfolded without resistance. Petition drives, political societies, and a lively Hawaiian language press challenged policies seen as eroding sovereignty and common welfare. Voices argued for reforms that protected both the Crown's prerogatives and the people's rights, warning that concessions made for immediate advantage could mortgage the future. The contest over Hawaii's direction was not hidden. It was printed, sung, and debated in public meeting halls.
Epidemics and demographic shifts darkened the backdrop. Earlier waves of disease had already taken a catastrophic toll. Plantation labor regimes and urbanization introduced new public health challenges. Schools multiplied, but teaching languages and curricula increasingly reflected missionary and commercial priorities. In families and villages, the work of cultural continuity, olelo Hawaii, hula, fishing knowledge, and place-based stewardship continued, though under growing strain from the cash economy and imported laws. By the late 1880s, the kingdom stood at a paradox. Legally modern and internationally recognized, yet internally reweighted so that economic leverage could be converted into political command. The crown remained, the ministries functioned, and treaties fluttered in portfolios, but the balance of power had shifted. It would take only one constitutional crisis, one determined clique, and one display of foreign force to push the system past its design limits.
Next, when a queen reaches for a new constitution, someone brings a gunboat to a paperwork fight. Chapter 4. The Overthrow and Annexation.
In January 1893, Queen Liliuokalani moved to restore a fuller constitutional monarchy. The 1887 Bayonet Constitution had curtailed royal authority and reshaped the electorate in favor of property and foreign influence. After petitions and elections signaled support for reform, the Queen prepared a new constitution intended to rebalance power and reaffirm Hawaiian political rights. It was a legal step debated in cabinet, anticipated by supporters, and dreaded by those whose leverage depended on the 1887 framework. Opponents organized as a committee of safety, an alliance of prominent businessmen, lawyers, and politicians tied to sugar, shipping, and missionary-descended networks. They framed the Queen's move as a threat to order and commerce. Behind closed doors, they coordinated with sympathetic figures in the U.S. legation. The American minister, John L. Stevens, took an extraordinary step. He recognized the committee's self-proclaimed provisional government and requested the landing of U.S. Marines and sailors from the USS Boston. The landing force positioned itself in Honolulu. It did not fire shots, but its presence shifted the balance at a decisive moment. Liliuokalani faced a cruel equation. The Royal Guard was loyal, many subjects were ready to resist, yet bloodshed in the capital could invite catastrophe, especially with foreign forces on the street and a minister extending de facto recognition to her opponents. The Queen yielded her authority under protest expressly to the United States, trusting that an investigation would restore constitutional order. Her statement made two things clear. She did not abdicate sovereignty, and she appealed to international norms and U.S. principles to correct what she called a grievous wrong. In Washington, President Grover Cleveland withdrew the annexation treaty that the provisional government had rushed forward. He sent James H. Blount as a special commissioner to investigate. The Blount Report, 1893, described the landing of U.S. forces as unjustified and called the overthrow improper. Cleveland urged restoration of the Queen, but Honolulu's provisional government, led by Sanford B. Dole, refused. A subsequent Senate inquiry, the Morgan Report, 1894, reached a different conclusion, exonerating U.S. officials and shifting responsibility onto local actors. The result was stalemate, moral condemnation from the executive branch, political cover from parts of Congress, and a determined regime in Honolulu tightening its grip. The provisional government declared itself the Republic of Hawaii in 1894, with Dole as president. New laws consolidated control, managed dissent, and prepared the legal ground for annexation. Hawaiian petitions and protests continued. Tens of thousands signed the Ku'e petitions, 1897, against annexation, while organizers lobbied in Washington to block the necessary two-thirds vote in the U.S. Senate. For a time, they succeeded. A formal treaty could not pass. But events beyond Hawaii shifted the tide. In 1898, the Spanish-American War recast the Pacific. U.S. strategists viewed Hawaii as a vital mid-ocean base for ships and cables. When a treaty remained uncertain, Congress used a different tool, the Newlands Resolution, a joint resolution requiring simple majorities rather than a supermajority. In July 1898, the resolution passed. President McKinley signed it. Formal transfer took place the same year. In 1900, the Organic Act made Hawaii a U.S. territory, transforming crown and government lands into so-called ceded lands held by the United States. Later, the state of Hawaii, without the consent of the Hawaiian sovereign or people. Annexation was not only a flag change, it rearranged institutions, property, and language. English became the mandatory medium in public schools by law in 1896, accelerating the suppression of Olelo Hawaii in classrooms. Political power concentrated in territorial structures that answered to Washington more than to local consensus. Business interests that had backed the overthrow now operated with the protections of U.S. law and markets. For many Kanaka Maoli, the loss was measured in dispossession and disenfranchisement. For advocates of state building, it was presented as progress and security. Yet, Hawaiian resistance and resilience persisted. Cultural practice moved in families and halau. Newspapers continued to argue the case for rights and memory. Petitions, lawsuits, and later political movements kept the question of justice alive. The story did not end in 1898 or 1900. It continued in courts, classrooms, and communities. Decades later, apologies and acknowledgments would enter official records. But the daily work of repairing language, land, and law fell to organizers, educators, and elders who refused to accept that annexation erased history. The overthrow and annexation can be narrated as a sequence of legal maneuvers, diplomatic cables, and economic incentives. It can also be told as a conflict between a small Pacific kingdom and the strategic appetites of an empire in an age of steam and steel. Both frames are true, and both risk obscuring the human center. A queen who sought lawful reform, citizens who petitioned in their tens of thousands, and communities that navigated loss with intellect, faith, and stubborn continuity.
Next, ukuleles, protest signs, and a certain TV show reminding everyone the crown was real. Chapter 5. Echoes in Modern Culture.
Hawaii's story did not end with annexation. It changed channels. In the late 20th century, a cultural renaissance brought ʻōlelo Hawaiʻi back into classrooms, hula and mele back into the open, and voyaging knowledge back onto the ocean in double-hulled canoes. Activists challenged bombing on Kahoʻolawe and defended Mauna Kea. Teachers built immersion schools. Navigators rebuilt sea roads. Out of that long revival comes a simple global fact. For millions of people, the screen is now the first teacher, which means that popular dramatizations carry unusual weight. Enter Apple TV Plus's Chief of War. Framed through Kaʻiana, warrior, traveler, and eventual defector, the series promises an indigenous lens, extensive dialogue in ʻōlelo Hawaiʻi, and a Polynesian-led cast and crew. It is the most visible attempt yet to move Hawaii's unification from postcards and footnotes into a living world of law, protocol, and hard choices. In this chapter, we use the archive like a lantern. We'll point where the show aligns with historical record, where it compresses or takes license, and how to watch it critically without losing the joy of a good story. What the series gets right. Screen and sources agree. The Four Kingdom chessboard. Hawaii, Maui, Oahu, and Kauai did form a real and shifting power map in the late 18th century. Alliances, marriages, and rivalries shaped every campaign and council. Innovation without erasure. Muskets, cannon, and foreign advisors appear alongside koa warriors and canoes. That mix mirrors accounts of the time. New tools added reach and shock, but seamanship, formations, and logistics still decided outcomes. Kaʻiana's arc in broad strokes. A high-ranking ali'i, Kaʻiana travels, fights with Kamehameha, then, after court tensions and exclusion from planning, defects to Oahu's side and dies during the Nu'uanu campaign. The pivot is documented, even if motives are debated. Nu'uanu's terrain and stakes. Artillery matters. Heights matter. Panic near the Pali turns a retreat into a rout. The battle is the keystone of Oahu's fall and the pathway to eventual unification. Hawaiian language and protocol. Hearing formal speech, chant, and court ceremony in Hawaiian re-centers the political world as Hawaiians themselves would have heard and enacted it.
Where drama probably bends the record. A single hero's lens. Centering Kaʻiana clarifies the plot, but can flatten the council-driven nature of chiefly politics. Many decisions were collective, negotiated, or ritual-bounded. Clean motives, quick turns. On screen, defections and betrayals arrive with crisp causes. In sources, reasons overlap: status anxieties, prophetic fears, perceived slights, strategic calculations. Timeline compression. Campaigns fought over months or years can unfold in a single episode. Rituals, logistics, and weather windows are streamlined to get to the clash. Composite or boosted characters. To keep arcs tidy, the series appears to merge or magnify certain figures and court factions. This is a common device, but not how the record reads line by line. Set-piece spectacle. Shark wrestling, prolonged duels, and tidily choreographed melees play well on television. Eyewitness-grounded histories emphasize formations, flanking, artillery positioning, and morale. A heroic logline versus a complicated life. Promotional copy that frames Kaʻiana as on a mission to unite his homeland collides with a documented defection and death opposing Kamehameha at Nu'uanu. The lived story is more tragic and more interesting than a straight hero's journey. Comparisons you'll see us make on screen with receipts. Language. The show's extensive use of ʻōlelo Hawaiʻi and protocol aligns with how courts and chiefs actually spoke and moved. It's a genuine corrective to decades of English-only portrayals. Foreign advisors. Depictions of men like John Young and Isaac Davis elsewhere, training gunnery and tactics match the sources, though the series may over-isolate their influence relative to Hawaiian commanders who integrated new tools into existing doctrine. The Battle of Nu'uanu. Expect accurate terrain and the decisive role of artillery on the valley heights. Also expect stylized hero combats that the archive doesn't guarantee. Kaʻiana's defection.
The show renders it as a dramatic break. The record preserves multiple reasons: exclusion from a war council, fear for his standing or safety, court rivalries. We'll lay those sources side by side. Kauai's endgame. If future seasons hint at or depict the final unification, note that Kauai joins by diplomacy under Kaʻahumanu in 1810 rather than by conquest, a major historical beat that often surprises first-time audiences.
How to watch critically without losing the magic.
Enjoy the scale. Seeing canoes under full sail, feather capes, and heiau ceremonies at true size resets the imagination. Keep that sense of awe. Follow the paperwork. Constitutions, land commissions, petitions, and court cases are the quiet machinery of the kingdom. Whenever the show skips them, remember they still turned the gears. Track who gets to speak. If a scene leans on one man's revelation, ask which voices the archive preserves. Female chiefs, like Kaʻahumanu, priests, commoners, foreign consuls, Hawaiian language newspaper editors, and what their versions add. Remember, the map extends past the postcard. The arc doesn't end at the pali. It runs onto failed invasions of Kauai, epidemics, diplomacy, and a peaceful submission that completed the unification in 1810. Why this matters beyond the credits. The series can widen the gate. Millions will discover that Hawaii had treaties, constitutions, courts, literacy, and ministers traveling oceans on the kingdom's business. But spectacle is not a syllabus. When dramatization rushes, we slow down. When a scene simplifies, we add the missing gears. And when the show gets something right, language, protocol, political complexity, we'll say so, because accuracy deserves praise as loudly as error deserves correction. Closing thought and invitation. Popular storytelling can honor a nation's memory or pave over it. Our promise in this film is to keep the archive lit while we enjoy the show. After the episode ends, let's talk. What felt true? What felt tidy? And which questions you want the record to answer next.
Next, cast your vote, join the crew, and tell us whether the sword fights or the sources stole the scene before we sail into the epilogue.
Support the series by becoming a member or visiting our shop. Drop your takeaway below and tell us what the show got right.
Watch the America playlist next to keep the story flowing. Take care and see you in the next chapter.
Across voyaging routes and courtrooms, petitions, and battlefields, the Hawaiian Kingdom emerges as more than a backdrop to paradise. It was a sovereign state built on knowledge of stars, seas, seasons, laws, and defended by leaders who tried to read a changing world as carefully as they read the tide. Its fall did not erase its fingerprints. They remain in place, names and protocols, in archives and songs, in families who kept language and ceremony alive when politics tried to quiet them. The record shows how design and chance traveled together. Innovation served tradition when it strengthened stewardship. It broke trust when it excused extraction. Diplomacy extended dignity across oceans. It also brought appetites that could not be bargained away. The same documents that proved a modern state, constitutions, court opinions, land awards, became the levers by which power shifted. That tension is the thread we followed. A kingdom thinking in law and ritual, adapting with intelligence, and then facing forces that measured value in markets and maps. If popular storytelling returns to this past now, in classrooms, on stages, and on screens, it carries an opportunity and a duty. The opportunity is reach. Millions can learn that Hawaii had treaties and newspapers, ministers and ministries, not just beaches and battles. The duty is fidelity. To let Kanaka Maoli voices lead. To distinguish spectacle from evidence. To keep the story complex where the truth is complex, and clear where the record is clear. We close where we began, with the ocean as teacher. The canoe that leaves land must carry its necessities in order: food, water, tools, knowledge, and trust. The kingdom did the same. Some cargo was taken, some was scattered. Yet the route remains charted, and navigators still sail it. A language regrows in schools, a double-hulled canoe crosses oceans, a chant is taught, and with it, the names of winds. Memory is not a monument, it is a practice. Nothing we have shown asks the past to be perfect. It asks us to be honest. To say that a queen sought lawful reform, that citizens petitioned in their tens of thousands, that annexation reordered land and power, that communities endured and continue to rebuild what is theirs to keep. To say that a series can open a door and that the archive can light the room, and to admit that we are still learning how to hear the sources with the attention they require. If this documentary has done its work, it has widened the picture, beyond postcard and battlefield, beyond a single hero or a single law.
A black desert of lava. A finale where the island itself seems to pass judgment. In Apple TV Plus's series Chief of War, Season 1 ends with fire, ash, and a name that won't sit still. Kaʻiana, survivor, insider, future threat. Here in Chief of War versus History, Kaʻiana's Last Stand, we put the show on one side and the record on the other. What the series fuses into one eruption, the sources split across years. A disaster in 1790, a killing in 1791, and a reckoning in 1795. This is Chief of War versus History, Kaʻiana's Last Stand. Stories have heat. Chief of War gives us lava and loyalties, a finale where the island itself seems to speak. We come to it with respect, for the drama on screen and for the record kept in ink and ash. Here we set the show beside the sources, not to scold, but to listen. We follow paper before spectacle, journals, letters, Hawaiian language newspapers, and the footprints pressed into the Kaʻu ash in 1790. And we choose our words with care: Kapu, heiau, ali'i, names that carry centuries. We speak them as they deserve: Kilauea, Ka'u, Puʻukoholā, Nu'uanu. This isn't a takedown, it's a conversation between cinema and sources. When the series lands close, we'll say so. When it compresses or moves pieces, we'll trace the seam. If an explanation can carry the weight, it stands. If it can't, we'll mark the gap and keep the wonder. With that spirit, we begin. Chapter 1. How Season 1 ends. The stage is a black desert of cooled lava, heat wavering at the horizon, and politics laid bare in the open. Lines harden on the ground the way they have already hardened in the heart. Chiefs gather with names that carry weight. Retainers measure loyalties by the heartbeat, and ash hangs in the air like a warning that refuses to settle. At the edge of this arena stands Kaʻiana, charismatic, worldly, stubbornly alive. He carries the glamour of distance and the gravity of experience. Foreign decks under his feet, new weapons in his hands, rooms where whispers travel in more than one language. Close to power and closer to danger, he reads weather and intrigue with the same practiced calm. He is neither king nor chorus, but a hinge on which larger doors might swing. He is here to win the day, or at least to keep tomorrow open. Opposing forces brace. On one side, Keōua holds the line, proud, wounded, unwilling to let his name be folded into anyone else's song. On the other, Kamehameha's ranks steady themselves with a discipline that says more than armor can. The distance between the two sides is short enough for insults and long enough for prophecy. The land itself feels hostile. Black shards that cut without moving, fissures that breathe, a fine powder that claims the mouth and stubbornly refuses the lungs. Then the island answers. A hush gathers where drums once lived. Wind shifts. Birds leave the sky. Heat bends the air until the familiar turns doubtful. What sounded like breath begins to sound like a word, and the word is move. Battle fires in bursts, charges that collapse into grapples, volleys that unravel into smoke. Ash behaves like weather. Men wrap cloth across their mouths, not as ritual, but as reflex. What began as a clash of lines becomes a struggle against a field that insists on judging the fight as much as hosting it. Flame lifts along cracked horizons. Cinders erase distance. Thunder takes the place of speech. Gray overlays the face, then red. The eruption refuses to play the part of scenery. It presses forward as verdict. In this telling, Keōua's fate arrives with the ash, leader and symbol at once, his death folding the fight into a single, enormous punctuation mark. Orders turn into prayers, resolve turns into awe, and the island seems to speak with a voice no chief can match. Kaʻiana survives, not cleanly and not heroically, survives. Eyes stung, skin mapped by sparks, voice sanded down to a whisper. He walks out of the day with the kind of memory that never fully cools. Whether he lived by instinct, luck, or some private oath with experience remains unspoken. What remains certain is the mark this leaves on him. He will carry the heat in ways that are visible and ways that are not. Water resets the scene. Celebration breaks on one shore, victory sung with salt still on the lips. On another, oaths harden in a quiet room, a blade laid flat, a promise that needs no audience to be dangerous. The board resets. Names do not change, but their meanings do. The same syllables begin to weigh differently in the mouth. The same faces are measured by new angles of light. Kaʻiana's name circulates with a double edge. Admiration speaks at first, his skill at sea, his comfort with weapons and discipline, his sense for the larger map. Calculation speaks it next. How to keep him close, how to keep him contained, how to use his reach without letting it reach too far. He is welcome at the table and tested with every cup. People want him near because he makes the room feel larger and the future feel nearer. They fear him for exactly the same reason. Hands become the language of the aftermath. A strategist traces a coastline and finds an advantage that wasn't visible yesterday. A priest seals a blessing that is also a warning. A warrior smooths ash from a blade he swears he cleaned already. Mouths follow with words that do not always mean themselves. Congratulations that arrive with conditions. Condolences that travel too smoothly to be entirely human. Every gesture repeats the same truth. Peace is a costume change, not a change of heart. The island offers omens for anyone willing to see them. A fisher keeps smoking after the ground has gone quiet. A sail appears where no ship should be yet. A dog refuses a familiar threshold as if it has learned something the household has not. The day looks finished, but behaves like a door that was closed gently, not locked. Kaʻiana walks the edge of celebration as if it might be a cliff. He knows how quickly a song turns into an argument, and how quickly an argument turns into a list of names. He knows admiration and fear can drink from the same cup without breaking it. He knows the talent that earns invitations also invites ambushes. He moves as if the room itself were taking notes. He is given a moment alone, or close enough to alone for the heart to steady. Ash still rides the hairline like a crown that didn't get the message. Flame flickers in the eye, not as ornament, but as proof that the day still lives inside him. The words he might speak do not matter. The island has said enough for now. What remains is a rhythm rather than an answer. Drums, then no drums. Cheers, then a silence that counts by threes. Somewhere a canoe pushes into dark water without torches. Somewhere else, a list of names is folded twice and hidden in a sleeve. Each small act suggests that the next large act has already begun to breathe. The promise is not peace. The promise is more war, alliances reforged, a king's rise accelerated, debts called in with the kind of interest that grows overnight. In the middle of it stands a question that looks like a man. Kaʻiana, alive and admired, carrying knowledge that others envy and fear, and clearly standing in the sights of those who believe he knows too much. The heat still moves above the rock as if the day refuses to cool. The battlefield shrinks in the mind until it becomes one black shape among many, another stone added to a necklace of old ones. The island is not done speaking. Hold this picture in memory. Next comes the record that will test it. The years, the places, and the words that do not burn. Chapter 2. The Historical Record. We set the show beside the sources and let each keep its strength. The camera's lava spectacle is vivid, but the paper trail is precise. 3 separate acts anchor this story. When they stand apart, the arc of unification and Kaʻiana's fate become clearer. Beat A. 1790. The Kaʻu Desert and Kilauea's deadly episode. The record for 1790 is a volcanic disaster, not a battlefield execution. A powerful Kilauea episode pushed pyroclastic surges and choking ash across parts of the Kaʻu Desert. Men on the move, scouts, messengers, fighters, were caught in air that burned before blades could meet. The ground behaved like breath. Visibility fell to a moving curtain. Hundreds died. The most haunting trace is physical. Footprints pressed into the Kaʻu ash, preserved in place, testimony to movement through danger rather than a staged clash of lines. Hawaiian accounts and later geological work agree on the character of the event. Sudden, lethal, and indifferent to allegiance. Keōua Kuʻahuʻula, Kamehameha's principal rival on Hawaiʻi Island at this time, survives the 1790 disaster. It cripples his strength and complicates his logistics, but it does not deliver his death. Meanwhile, the balance of power is shifting for other reasons too. Increased access to firearms and cannon through foreign contact. The arrival of men who know how to drill formations and handle guns under stress. And the gradual spread of maritime knowledge among chiefly courts. In this same window of time, foreign incidents tilt the technical playing field. Traders and their ships introduce muskets and artillery more reliably. Advisors familiar with naval discipline begin to matter. The combination of Hawaiian leadership and imported methods becomes a force multiplier. Nature injures, it does not decide. Beat B, 1791, Puʻukoholā heiau and the killing of Keōua. The next act is ceremonial and political, not geological. In 1791, Kamehameha convenes power at Kauai on Hawai'i Island, near a massive heiau he has ordered built, Puʻukoholā. Prophecy and strategy meet in stone. The heiau rises by hand and line, rock carried in human chains, an architecture that declares intention long before any ceremony is performed. Keōua approaches under terms of parley. Accounts agree that he is killed near the landing, and that his body is offered at Puʻukoholā heiau. Some traditions add details about actions he took to alter his ritual status. Sources differ on the sequence and meaning of those moments. What does not differ is the outcome. Keōua's death happens here, in the shadow of a temple, and within a grammar of rule that binds sacrifice, legitimacy, and consolidation of Hawai'i Island. There is no eruption on this day, no black desert. The power on display is human. Alliances, priests, Kapu, and the deliberate use of ceremony to harden a political claim. From this vantage, the show's fusion of disaster and death turns two distinct endings: terror in 1790 and finality in 1791, into one cinematic blow. The record asks us to keep them separate, so that agency remains visible. The earth injures. Leaders decide. Beat C, 1795, Kaʻiana's defection and the Battle of Nu'uanu, Oahu. By the mid-1790s, the struggle moves beyond Hawai'i Island. Kamehameha's forces have already demonstrated reach and discipline in earlier campaigns, training with firearms, using cannon effectively from shore and from double-hulled canoes, and coordinating fleets with growing confidence. Against this backdrop, court tensions around Kaʻiana widen. Kaʻiana is a high-ranking ali'i with a reputation for travel and cosmopolitan skill. He has sailed with foreigners, seen ports beyond Hawaii, and returned with weapons, artisans, and ideas. For a time, he stands close to Kamehameha. Later, he is sidelined and feels it. When Kamehameha assembles the great fleet to move on Oahu, Kaʻiana defects to Kalani Kupule's side. Sources differ on the exact moments that follow, but converge on the essentials. Early in the Battle of Nu'uanu, Kaʻiana is killed. Some say by artillery fire directed by gunners trained by foreign advisors, others by close action as positions shift. His death matters because he carried more than rank. He understood the new grammar of war, muskets drilled in sequence, the timing of volleys, the value of terrain under fire. Remove that understanding early, and the line that needs it begins to fray. Nu'uanu's terrain does the rest. The valley narrows, the pali cliffs rise, and a retreat becomes a funnel. As pressure mounts, defenders are driven upward toward the precipice. The rout at the pali becomes the image that endures. Kalani Kupule flees and is later captured. Oahu falls. Kamehameha's unification accelerates from intent to momentum. The role of foreign expertise is plain but not dominant. Hawaiian leadership sets the goals and chooses the ground. Advisors and weapons amplify capacity. Names like John Young and Isaac Davis appear in multiple accounts as men who help organize firepower, maintain guns, and steady formations. Their presence underscores how quickly chiefly courts absorb and deploy outside techniques. What wins is not a single cannon shot. It is command, logistics, and will. Clean timeline. Keep these acts distinct. Year 1790. Ka'u Desert, Kilauea episode. Lethal ash and surges kill many of Keōua's men during movement. Keōua survives. The event hurts capacity, but does not decide leadership. Year 1791. Puʻukoholā heiau, Kauai. Keōua is killed near the landing. His body is offered at the heiau. Kamehameha consolidates Hawaiʻi Island through ceremony and statecraft. Year 1795. Nu'uanu, Oahu. Kaʻiana defects to Oahu's side and is killed early in the battle. Kalani Kupule's defense collapses. Kamehameha's path to unification opens. What the show gains by merging, and what the record protects. The effect is powerful and emotionally legible. The cost is clarity. When the volcanic image swallows the heiau, the audience loses sight of agency. Who chose, who ordered, who accepted responsibility. Keeping the events distinct restores that line of sight. Names and language. Precision is part of respect. We keep Okina and Kahako where they belong. Kilauea, Ka'u, Puʻukoholā, Nu'uanu. We use Kapu, heiau, ali'i with their meanings intact. Pronunciation guides and on-screen spellings help without slowing the story. With the record clear, the next act points to Oahu's campaign in detail. How alliances shifted after Puʻukoholā, how fleets were provisioned and coordinated, how artillery and muskets were drilled, and how Kaʻiana's decision shaped the opening minutes of Nu'uanu. Season 2, at its best, would live here, in logistics, choices, and the speed at which a kingdom learns to move. Chapter 3. What Season 2 should cover. If the series follows the record, the next arc lives on Oahu. After Puʻukoholā in 1791, power hardens on Hawaiʻi Island while preparations widen. Fleets assembled, guns maintained, allies courted. And supply moved where sail and current will carry it. Foreign advisors steady the new tools, but Hawaiian leadership sets the pace. The question is no longer whether Kamehameha can project force. It is where and when he chooses to land it. Kaʻiana stands at the hinge of that choice. He is a high-ranking ali'i with ocean mileage, a man who has seen other ports and brought skills home. Ships handled with discipline, muskets drilled in sequence, cannon kept serviceable under pressure. For a season he is close to Kamehameha, then the circle tightens without him. Slights real or perceived court suspicion, and competing visions of how to use foreign knowledge widen the crack. When the Great Fleet gathers for Oahu, Kaʻiana decides. Calculation, not caricature. He moves to Kalani Kupule's side to shape the battle rather than be sidelined by it. The campaign deserves the texture of logistics. Canoes and transports do not simply appear at Waikiki. They are provisioned, repaired, and staged. Powder is kept dry. Shot is measured and paired to bore. Matches and flints are protected from salt. Chiefs count days of food and days of wind. Scouts watch channels for weather first and enemies second. Advisors who understand gunnery help coastal guns find elevation, while Hawaiian commanders decide where those guns will matter. A season that shows this work honors the speed at which a kingdom learns to move like a fleet, then the foothold. Landings on Oahu push a front inland toward Nu'uanu. Lines respond with a grammar that has changed. Volleys almost rhythmic. Positions chosen for fields of fire instead of spectacle. Reserves held where ground narrows. The old strengths do not vanish. Courage, chant, the authority of chiefs. But the battlefield now punishes any formation that forgets to breathe in time with gunpowder. This is where Kaʻiana's choice carries weight. He knows the new grammar and tries to make it speak for Oahu. Early in the fighting, he is killed. Accounts split between cannon fire directed by trained gunners and a closer strike in the confusion of shifting ground. Either way, a keystone goes missing. A commander who can steady lines under fire is taken out in the first act, and with him goes a margin Oahu cannot afford to lose. Nu'uanu gives the rest of the lesson. Valleys fold in. The Pali cliffs rise. Retreat becomes a funnel that sorts discipline from panic. Pressure climbs, positions tilt, and men are driven up toward the precipice. The image that endures, bodies over the Pali, belongs here, not to lava. It is the end of Oahu's defense and the opening of Kamehameha's road to unification. The aftermath should feel like consequence rather than epilogue. Kalani Kupule flees and is captured. Oahu is secured. Key captains and craftsmen are absorbed instead of discarded. Commanders who understand the new mix of canoe, sail, and shore battery begin to think past a single island. The map changes tone. What was ambition begins to look like momentum. To the west, Kauai holds out under Kaʻahumanu, a reminder that unification is a chain with more than one link. The eventual solution there is diplomacy rather than blood, another reason to keep war and statecraft distinct in the telling. Kaʻiana's legacy should split the room on purpose. To some, he is the defector who endangered unification. To others, he is a cosmopolitan innovator cut down too soon. A chief who saw the shape of tomorrow's battles more clearly than most. A season that lets both readings breathe will feel larger and truer. The point is not to flatten him into a single lesson, but to show how much a kingdom could gain and lose by learning fast. Season 2, at its best, would thread 5 movements. The pressure that builds after Puʻukoholā, the decision that moves Kaʻiana off Kamehameha's course, the landing and inland push on Oahu, the early death that changes the math at Nu'uanu, and the aftermath that turns one victory into a road toward many. Keep the names right. Kilauea, Ka'u, Puʻukoholā, Nu'uanu, and the choices visible. Let agency sit where it belongs, in councils, on decks, and under banners that the wind will test. Carry forward one habit: facts first, mystery intact. When the record holds, let it stand. Where it thins, mark the edge and move with care. In that space, a second season can respect the paper and still keep the island speaking. We set the show beside the record and kept both in view. The spectacle gave us a single eruption. The sources gave us 3 acts. 1790 in the Kaʻu Desert, 1791 at Puʻukoholā heiau, and 1795 at Nu'uanu. When those years stand apart, agency comes back into focus. Nature injures, leaders decide, campaigns resolve. Kaʻiana sits at the hinge. He survives the disaster the show turns into a finale, then walks into the politics that history places on Oahu. His choice, his death, and the speed of Kamehameha's unification mean more when they're tied to dates, places, and names spoken with care. Kilauea, Ka'u, Puʻukoholā, Nu'uanu. The point isn't to drain the drama. It's to keep the map honest while we keep the wonder. Facts first, mystery intact. This is Chief of War versus History, Kaʻiana's Last Stand. Tell us in the comments, what did the show get right? Where did it compress or move events? What should Season 2 cover in depth? Oahu's campaign, Kaʻiana's defection, Nu'uanu in full. Share your take and your sources below. Aloha kako, mahalo nui loa no kanana ana. Ahui ho kako. History remembers Kamehameha as the unifier of the islands. Yet his rise was shadowed by betrayal and blood. At Puʻukoholā heiau, prophecy demanded a sacrifice. Kaʻiana, once Kamehameha's closest ally, turned against him and fueled Keōua's defiance. And when Keōua finally stepped ashore, the fate of both men was sealed. This was not only the death of a chief, it was the birth of a nation. This is Puʻukoholā Explained, why Keōua really died. The Hawaiian Islands stood at a crossroads. Rival chiefs vied for power, and the balance of loyalty and survival shifted with every tide. Old alliances fractured as whispers of prophecy filled the air, prophecies that spoke of unity, but only through sacrifice. At Kauai, Kamehameha ordered stones to be hauled across the land, each rock laid into place by the hands of his people, each step watched by the eyes of his priests. This was Puʻukoholā, a heiau built not only of lava rock, but of ambition and divine mandate. It was said that if the temple were completed and consecrated with the blood of a rival, the islands would finally fall under one rule. Far from this rising fortress, Keōua Kuʻahuʻula weighed his own fate. He was a chief of lineage and strength, yet beset by omens of death. Some urged him to resist, others to submit, but the path ahead offered no safety. Every choice carried the shadow of destiny. Thus the stage was set. The Temple of War awaited its sacrifice, and the tide of unification prepared to sweep across Hawaiʻi. In the silence before the final act, all knew that the fate of Keōua would become the fate of the islands themselves. Chapter 1. The Rise of Puʻukoholā. Puʻukoholā heiau is often remembered simply as the temple that sealed Kamehameha's victory. Yet beneath its stones lies a story rarely told. Most accounts emphasize the prophecy that if Kamehameha dedicated this heiau with the blood of a rival chief, the gods would grant him the islands. But fewer ask how the temple itself became a weapon before any blood was spilled. The labor of building Puʻukoholā was not only spiritual, it was political theater. Thousands of men were summoned from across Hawaiʻi, their loyalty tested in the grueling work of hauling stones from Pololu Valley, miles away, through relays of human hands. To serve Kamehameha in this monumental project was to pledge allegiance, to bind one's body and lineage to his cause. Chiefs who hesitated risked being seen as disloyal, while those who obeyed grew invested in Kamehameha's rise. The heiau's location also carried meaning often overlooked. Perched above the harbor at Kauai, it was not just sacred ground, it was a statement of control over the northern approach to Hawaiʻi Island, a place where trade and travel converged. By building there, Kamehameha claimed both the spiritual high ground and the physical gateway to his kingdom. Even the temple's design whispers strategy. Puʻukoholā was constructed in the style of Oahu heiau, not the older Hawaiian forms of Hawaiʻi Island. This choice may reveal the influence of foreign knowledge arriving with Kaʻiana and other ali'i who had traveled beyond Hawaiʻi. It was as if Kamehameha was aligning himself with something broader, projecting authority that stretched beyond one island's traditions. Foreign observers also noticed how the building process itself mirrored European displays of kingship. Ships arriving from Britain and America described the spectacle of thousands moving in unison, carrying stones in a human chain that stretched for miles. For these foreigners, the scene was a demonstration of centralized authority. For Kamehameha's rivals, It was a warning that his reach extended into every valley and village. What we often miss is how the heiau was already shaping destiny long before Keōua's death. Its walls rose as both fortress and altar, warning rivals that Kamehameha's rule would rest not only on force, but on divine sanction. The temple was prophecy-made stone, a place where politics, religion, and fear merged into one. In this light, Puʻukoholā was not just a setting for sacrifice, but a declaration. Kamehameha would unite the islands not only with warriors and guns, but with the weight of the gods themselves. The heiau's stones carried voices louder than drums, and its shadow stretched over every choice that Keōua and his allies would soon face. Chapter 2. Keōua's Journey. Keōua Kuʻahula's final voyage to Kauai has often been framed as a fatal mistake. Yet his decision was far more complex than legend suggests. In the late 1790s, Hawaiʻi Island was torn between drought, warfare, and prophecy. For Keōua, every course of action carried danger, and the choice to sail north may have seemed like the least perilous of his options. Keōua ruled Kaʻu and Puna, regions that had long resisted Kamehameha's authority. These lands were not only politically defiant, but geologically unstable. Kilauea, the ever-active volcano, erupted violently during Keōua's campaigns. Oral traditions tell of his warriors caught in blasts of ash and poisonous gas near the Kapu desert, an event some took as a divine judgment against him. In Hawaiian thought, natural disasters were never random. They signaled the gods' shifting favor and carried political consequences as heavy as any battle. At the same time, Kaʻiana's defection reshaped the political chessboard. Once one of Kamehameha's most trusted lieutenants, Kaʻiana had joined forces with Keōua's rivals. His knowledge of Western weapons, fortifications, and tactics gave Keōua symbolic strength, but it also made him a marked man. To Kamehameha, Kaʻiana's betrayal was not only personal, it was a breach of trust that threatened the very foundation of his authority. By aligning with this traitor, Keōua was now cast as the embodiment of resistance to Kamehameha's destiny. Keōua's position grew even more precarious as famines spread across parts of his domain. Crops failed under the ash of volcanic eruptions, and villages weakened by scarcity became less able to support his campaigns. Chiefs loyal to him weighed their allegiance carefully, questioning whether continued defiance would bring only ruin. Each eruption, each failed harvest, each whisper of discontent added pressure to a leader already hemmed in by enemies. Why, then, did Keōua sail toward Puʻukoholā, knowing the omens and dangers that surrounded him? Some traditions speak of diplomacy, that he hoped to negotiate peace, or at least delay open war, buying time to rebuild his strength. Others point to prophecy, that by placing himself at the heiau, he might test or even overturn the fate promised to Kamehameha. A darker interpretation suggests he was persuaded by members of his own court, who believed his death might end their suffering by satisfying both the gods and Kamehameha's ambitions. In this view, Keōua was not only a chief making choices, but a pawn sacrificed by those closest to him. There is also the possibility that Keōua recognized the inevitability of his fate. In Hawaiian traditions of chiefly conduct, facing destiny with dignity was sometimes valued more than clinging to life in disgrace. By sailing into danger, he may have sought to secure his mana, ensuring that his name would endure even if his body fell. His journey was therefore not simply a march toward execution. It was a calculated, if desperate, step within a world where politics, faith, and survival were inseparable. Keōua's canoe did not just carry a chief, it carried the weight of Kaʻu's independence, the burden of volcanic omens, and the final gamble of a man caught between destiny and defiance. Chapter 3. The Death at the Shore. The meeting at Kaʻahumanu is often told as a single brutal moment. Keōua steps ashore, is struck down, and carried into Puʻukoholā heiau. Yet when we look closer, the scene reveals layers of ritual, strategy, and political theater that transformed an execution into an act of world-shaping symbolism. When Keōua's canoes appeared off the coast, Kamehameha's men controlled every vantage point. The harbor at Kaʻahumanu was a narrow stage, carefully chosen. Its waters funneled arrivals directly toward the shadow of the new heiau. Keōua could not approach without passing under the gaze of priests and warriors alike. Accounts describe Keōua disembarking and being welcomed, then suddenly attacked. Some sources say he was invited under a flag of truce. Others hint that the ambush was prearranged. A betrayal cloaked in ceremony. What unites these traditions is the immediacy. Keōua never crossed the threshold of Puʻukoholā alive. He fell at the shoreline, his body dragged into the heiau to complete the sacrifice. But this detail matters. For some Hawaiian traditions, a consecrated sacrifice had to be slain within the sacred boundaries. The fact that Keōua died before entering suggests tension between ritual requirement and political necessity. Was his death rushed, the result of warriors unwilling to risk hesitation? Or did the priests bend the rules of Kapu to match the urgency of unification? Either way, it marked a rare moment when political power dictated religious form, not the other way around. Kaʻiana's shadow also lingers over the scene. Though absent from Kaʻahumanu, his defection had primed Kamehameha to act ruthlessly. Keōua's body symbolized not just one rival, but the broader rebellion fed by Kaʻiana's betrayal. In death, Keōua became the scapegoat that erased Kamehameha's vulnerabilities and cemented his claim to divine favor. Foreigners who later heard the story emphasized the spectacle, the sacrifice of a chief at the very moment a temple was finished. For them, it echoed biblical or classical precedents, reinforcing the idea that Hawaiʻi was a stage where ancient drama unfolded anew. For Hawaiians, however, the act was not theater, it was prophecy fulfilled. The gods had demanded blood, and history answered. Thus the shoreline at Kaʻahumanu was more than the site of a killing. It was the hinge on which the islands turned. In Keōua's fall, Kamehameha rose unchallenged, and Puʻukoholā became not just a temple, but the altar on which an independent Hawaiʻi was born. Chapter 4. Aftermath and Legacy. With Keōua's death, the stones of Puʻukoholā heiau became more than a temple. They became the foundation of a new political order. For the first time, Kamehameha stood unchallenged on Hawaiʻi Island, free to expand his authority beyond its shores. Yet the aftermath was not only triumph, it was also a moment of reckoning, where violence, ritual, and prophecy reshaped the meaning of power. Among Kamehameha's supporters, Keōua's sacrifice was remembered as fulfillment of divine law. Priests pointed to the prophecy. The heiau had been completed, blood consecrated it, and the gods had granted unity. But within Keōua's homeland of Kaʻu, the memory was bitter. For them, the chief had not fallen in honorable battle, but had been betrayed. Oral traditions lingered with unease, recalling his final voyage as an act of manipulation rather than destiny. This dual memory, sacred victory for one side, injustice for the other, remains a fracture in Hawaiian storytelling even today. The consequences extended far beyond memory. By removing his greatest rival, Kamehameha freed resources to consolidate alliances on Maui and prepare for the campaigns that would eventually carry him to Oahu and Kauai. The heiau at Puʻukoholā became a visible warning to all who might resist. The gods and politics were now one. Every chief who passed its walls was reminded that disobedience could be answered not just with spears, but with sacrifice. Foreigners, too, interpreted the event in ways that shaped Hawaii's image abroad. Missionaries and traders recorded the killing of a high chief as evidence of a culture steeped in heathen violence, a view that would later justify their efforts to reshape Hawaiian society. Yet these same foreigners also marveled at Kamehameha's discipline and statecraft, comparing him to kings and emperors of the old world. In their eyes, the sacrifice of Keōua revealed both savagery and sovereignty, an image that would haunt Hawaii's history for generations. Perhaps most striking is how Keōua's death redefined leadership itself. In Hawaiian thought, mana, the spiritual power of a chief, could be transferred, consumed, or extinguished. By being offered at Puʻukoholā, Keōua's mana did not vanish. It was absorbed into the structure of the heiau, magnifying Kamehameha's authority. In this sense, the temple was not just a place of worship. It became a reservoir of political and spiritual energy, binding the fate of Hawaii to one man's vision. The legacy of Puʻukoholā is therefore not simply architectural. It is moral, spiritual, and political. For some, it symbolizes unification and the genius of Kamehameha's rise. For others, it stands as a reminder that Hawaii's unity was built on betrayal as much as prophecy. And for all, it remains a site where the boundary between history and memory blurs, where the death of one chief gave birth to a kingdom whose echoes still shape Hawaii today. History often celebrates victors, but the silence around Keōua's death tells us something deeper. His sacrifice was not just the price of unity, it was the reminder that kingdoms rise through choices marked by faith, ambition, and betrayal. Standing at Puʻukoholā today, one feels both the weight of stone and the echo of voices that will never be heard again. Hawaii's unification was not inevitable. It was carved into existence, and its costs still resonate in memory. For some, Puʻukoholā is a monument of triumph. For others, it is a scar of betrayal. But for all, it is a place where prophecy and politics collided, where a chief's last breath gave birth to a kingdom that would face its own storms in centuries to come. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, consider joining our Timeless Tales membership. You'll get early access to upcoming episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and a closer look at the mysteries we uncover. And don't forget to check out our new spring shop collection, including designs inspired by Hawaii's chiefs and warriors. Every membership and every purchase helps us keep history alive. Facts first, mystery intact. Mahalo nui loa for watching, and until next time, aloha.
Ua hoi mai ka lai ka moana e o i ka puku i ka malamalama e o ke au oi ka lane oi ka lane oi ka lane he mai na hoku ka lai ka oi halo o ke anu e una i ka puaku e mai ka ua oi
In the islands once ruled by gods and warriors, a new power was rising. Her name was Kaʻahumanu, born of chiefs, destined to outthink kings. When Kamehameha forged Hawaiʻi into one kingdom, she stood beside him, silent, watching, learning every move of war and rule. And when the great conqueror fell, the question was no longer who would fight for the throne, but who would rule it. This is Hawaii's Queen, the Queen Kaʻahumanu versus Chief of War. The death of Kamehameha I left Hawaiʻi trembling. For years, his word had been law, a balance of fear, faith, and force. Now, the throne was empty, and the islands waited to see who would claim his shadow. In the silence after the drums, two powers began to move. One was the old order, chiefs who still believed that strength came from blood and battle. The other was something new, a woman who had learned how to rule without raising a spear. Kaʻahumanu had stood beside the conqueror long enough to know his secrets. She understood that power was not taken once. It had to be held, every day, with mind and will. And so began a struggle not of armies, but of ideas. A war fought in whispers, alliances, and royal courts. Chapter 1. The Rise of Kaʻahumanu. She entered the royal court as a young chiefess with sharp eyes and a memory that missed nothing. Where others chased glory and battle, she watched the currents that moved people, gifts, loyalties, jealousies, old vows no one dared to break. As Kamehameha built a kingdom from scattered wars, Kaʻahumanu learned the architecture of power from the inside. She understood who carried real influence: the chiefs who controlled harvests and harbors, the priests who kept the Kapu, the stewards who could quietly redirect canoes, labor, and news. She learned when to speak and when silence could buy a future favor. Marriage bound her to the conqueror, but presence made her indispensable. She read the room of ali'i like a navigator reads swells. Subtle shifts foretold storms. When disputes rose, she found the single concession that turned enemies into cautious partners. When tempers burned too hot, she cooled them with timing. A postponement, a visit, a feast that let pride walk away with dignity and tact. Power in Hawaiʻi was never only a spear, it was protocol. Kaʻahumanu mastered the language of entrances and placements, of who sat where and who was named first. She learned that a public gesture could be more decisive than a private threat. And she kept score, who owed what to whom, until debts could be called in with one carefully chosen request. In the shadow of temples and the drums of victory, she studied limits as closely as strengths. Armies could win battles, but could they hold distant valleys during famine? Priests could declare taboos, but could they reverse a failing season? Each weakness mapped a path for a new kind of rule, one built not on fear alone, but on the coordination of many hands. By the time Kamehameha's great campaigns slowed, Kaʻahumanu had assembled her own invisible network. Trusted attendants, messengers who moved between courts, women of rank who could sway their husbands and brothers, stewards who managed stores and ships. It was not a conspiracy. It was competence, quiet, constant, and underestimated. She did not need to be the loudest voice in council. Influence flowed to her because she made it useful to stand close. Those who dismissed her as a consort discovered, slowly, that decisions now bent around her presence. What began as access became leverage. Leverage, authority. And when the day came that the kingdom's future would depend less on who could strike and more on who could steady the helm, Kaʻahumanu was already there, hands light on the wheel, eyes on the horizon, ready to turn a warrior's empire into a governed nation. Chapter 2. The Chief of War. He was called the Chief of War, a man carved from the old god's image, loyal to the code that had shaped generations of warriors. To him, Kaʻahumanu was not a queen, but a challenge to the order of the world itself. He had fought beside Kamehameha in the island wars, earning scars that spoke louder than words. Where she saw diplomacy as power, he saw it as weakness. Where she built alliances through patience, he trusted only in the strength of arms. Each carried a vision of Hawaii's future, hers bound by reason, his by faith in the ancient Kapu that had guided the chiefs since time immemorial. In councils, their silence was its own battle. She would wait, eyes fixed, letting him speak first. He would stand, voice rising like surf against rock, warning of decay, that women in power would unmake the sacred balance, that the gods would abandon a kingdom led by mortal ambition. But beneath his fury lay fear, not of Kaʻahumanu, but of the change she embodied. He saw the foreigners arriving, the ships, the strange prayers, the tools that could shape both war and thought. He believed these were omens, tests sent by the gods. Kaʻahumanu believed they were opportunities, instruments of survival in a world that would no longer wait for Hawaiʻi to decide its own fate. Between them, the court divided. Old priests whispered that the queen's influence defied the gods. Younger chiefs watched her closely, wondering if perhaps power could be sharper when it did not draw blood. Even Kamehameha's successors hesitated, caught between loyalty to tradition and awe of her control. There were moments when their conflict nearly turned to open war. Rumors spread of armed gatherings in distant valleys, of men who swore they would never bow to a woman's rule. But Kaʻahumanu understood that the strongest walls were not made of stone. They were made of stories. She allowed his threats to echo until they exhausted themselves. Then she acted quietly, removing his allies one by one, through marriage ties, land disputes, or carefully timed forgiveness that turned defiance into debt. The Chief of War, once a hero, began to find himself surrounded by silence. Those who had once shouted his name now listened to hers. He could not understand how power could move without battle drums, how loyalty could shift without a sword being drawn. Yet deep within, he knew she was right. The world was changing, and his kind of strength, the kind that lived and died on the battlefield, could not hold it together forever. He was the last guardian of an age already fading, and she, standing calm amid the storm, was the first architect of what would replace it. Their struggle was never just for a crown, it was for the soul of Hawaiʻi, for what would remain sacred and what would be reborn. Chapter 3. The Battle for the Throne. The throne of Hawaiʻi was never built for peace. When Kamehameha's voice fell silent, his heirs inherited not only a kingdom, but a storm. No map could guide them now, only the unseen currents of loyalty and fear. Kaʻahumanu moved first. She understood that whoever controlled the young king would control the realm. With calm precision, She stepped into the royal court and claimed a title no one had yet imagined. Kuhina Nui, co-ruler. It was not a demand, but a statement. The conqueror's vision would live on through her hands. The chief of war saw it as betrayal. To him, this was no act of stewardship. It was conquest by another name. He gathered the old warriors, those who still burned incense for the gods of war, those who whispered that no woman could share the throne of a king. In the gatherings of chiefs, he invoked the past, the Kapu system, the sacred laws, the bloodlines that defined right to rule. And yet, the queen's influence reached further than their chants could carry. She understood the language of inheritance, not just of blood, but of legitimacy. She called on the widows of Kamehameha, on priests who owed her quiet debts, and on messengers who traveled between islands spreading a simple truth: that she, more than anyone, understood what the late king had built and what could still destroy it. In court, every glance was strategy, every feast a test. A seat too close to the queen meant allegiance. A delayed invitation meant exile. It was a battle fought without spears, a war of patience and perception. The chief of war countered with strength, assembling his followers in remote valleys, gathering men who longed for the certainty of the old code. But the queen's victories were invisible. A chief's son sent to her service, a rival's marriage arranged, a land grant retracted without public notice. Each move weakened his footing until even his allies began to doubt. At last, the confrontation neither could avoid arrived. Before the Council of Ali'i, she spoke not with rage, but with conviction. She spoke of balance, of a kingdom that must stand united under law, not divided by fear. She offered him dignity, the right to remain a guardian of the old faith, even as the kingdom looked to new ways. It was not surrender she asked for, but adaptation. Yet to him, change was death. He left the council in silence, the air heady with finality. Those who followed him would soon find their cause slipping into memory. The throne did not fall that day. It transformed. Kaʻahumanu had turned battle into governance, warriors into counselors, enemies into witnesses of a new order. The kingdom would survive not because of the wars it had won, but because of the one it would never need to fight again. For the first time in Hawaii's history, power no longer wore armor. It spoke softly, and everyone listened. If this story pulled you in, subscribe and join us for the next chapter. Facts first, mystery intact, every week. Next, Faith and Fire, how one decision ended centuries of Kapu and set Hawaiʻi on a collision course with new gods. Chapter 4, Faith and Fire. The drums of war had gone silent, but another battle was coming, one that no spear could win. Across the horizon, sails appeared like white omens. The strangers who stepped ashore carried not weapons but books, and words that promised salvation. To Kaʻahumanu, they looked less like conquerors and more like a new kind of power, one that ruled through belief. The old priests warned her. They said that to abandon the Kapu, the sacred code, was to invite ruin. For centuries, the Kapu had bound heaven and earth. Who could eat? Who could speak? Who could live? It kept the islands balanced, or so the gods had decreed. But Kaʻahumanu saw another truth, that fear had become the crown Hawaiʻi wore every day. The chief of war and his followers clung to the past. They built fires to the old gods, praying for storms to drive the foreigners away. To them, these pale men were the shadow of extinction, and the queen its herald. But she did not tremble. She had watched the world change once before, under Kamehameha. Now she would change it again. Not through conquest, but conviction. She walked into the temple courtyards where generations had bowed in silence, and she spoke the words no ruler before her dared to say. The Kapu is broken. The gasp that followed shook more than the walls. It cracked the spine of the old world. The flames that once burned for the gods now burned the idols themselves. Smoke rose into the blue, carrying centuries of worship into the wind. Some said she was possessed. Others said enlightened. But none could deny what followed. The young king stood beside her, his hesitation swallowed by her certainty. Together they watched as temples fell quiet, drums ceased, and Hawaii took its first breath as something new. Faith and fire, two forces that had always shaped these islands, now collided in her hands. To destroy the old was to risk the soul of the kingdom, yet to keep it was to chain the future. Kaʻahumanu chose the path of flame. When the missionaries knelt before her, reading from their foreign book, she listened, not as a servant of their God, but as a sovereign testing the strength of another empire's faith. In their words, she heard both danger and promise, that ideas could travel farther than armies. And in that moment, she understood what every ruler must, that power does not vanish, it only changes form. The gods of stone had fallen, the gods of ink had arrived, and standing between them was a queen who had dared to command both. Chapter 5. The Last Rebellion. The breaking of the Kapu did not bring peace. It brought confusion, and for some, fury. The gods had been silenced, but not everyone believed they were gone. Across the islands, whispers turned to vows. Old warriors gathered again, their drums returning like distant thunder. They carried no foreign words, no written faith, only the memory of the flames that once kept their ancestors' spirits alive. To them, Kaʻahumanu's rule was not liberation, it was blasphemy. The chief of war, though weakened and old, became their symbol once more. His scars were proof of a time when men answered only to the gods of their fathers. He spoke of omens, of earthquakes, of failing crops, of storms as signs that the old spirits demanded vengeance. And the people listened, for fear always listens first. Kaʻahumanu understood the danger. A rebellion of swords she could face. But this was a rebellion of belief, harder to kill than any army. Her advisors urged her to crush it quickly. But she had learned that every victory leaves an echo. To silence them by force would make martyrs of men who no longer mattered. So she chose a different kind of battle. She sent messengers, not soldiers, to the rebel chiefs. She offered them forgiveness if they would lay down their arms, land if they would swear peace. Some refused, shouting that the queen's mercy was poison. But others, weary, hungry, uncertain, began to listen. Still, there were those who would not bend. They built their final camp in the shadows of the mountains, where smoke rose in defiance. The queen's forces surrounded them, yet she ordered no attack. Days passed. The fires burned lower. When at last she rode to the edge of their camp, she came unarmed. The chief of war stood before her, eyes hollow with years of loss. Between them lay everything Hawaii had been, and everything it was becoming. He asked her, "Do you not fear the gods you've betrayed?" She answered, "If they are gods, they will endure without your spears." No one moved. No blade was drawn. And in that silence, the rebellion ended. The old chief turned away, his warriors following him into the forest like shadows dissolving at dawn. Some would say the gods left with them. Others whispered that Kaʻahumanu had conquered not men, but time itself. When the sun rose the next morning, its light touched temples without priests, altars without offerings. The kingdom still stood, but it was not the same kingdom anymore. The fires of rebellion had burned away the last illusions of the past. What remained was something fragile and new. Kaʻahumanu had not only ruled Hawaiʻi, she had remade it. And like all great revolutions, hers began not with conquest, but with conviction. Chapter 6: Legacy of a Queen. History remembers Kaʻahumanu in fragments. A queen, a regent, a reformer, a heretic. But every piece of her story carries the same fire: the will to decide what Hawaiʻi would become. After the last rebellion faded, she ruled not through fear but through order. Her council stretched from island to island, weaving laws that blended tradition with the new faith. She created schools where once there had been silence, laws where once there had been taboo. Her signature began to appear beside that of kings, a quiet testament that power, once seized by men in battle, could now flow through the hand of a woman with vision. Yet her reign was not gentle. She demanded obedience with the same iron that had once shaped the spears of Kamehameha. Those who defied the new laws found their lands stripped, their names forgotten. Her justice was swift, and it was lasting. Some called her savior, others called her destroyer. Missionaries praised her as the chosen vessel of God. Priests whispered that she had traded the soul of Hawaiʻi for foreign salvation. But Kaʻahumanu cared little for praise or blame. She had lived long enough to understand that every change births its own mythology. As years passed, she grew frail but never diminished. From her seat in Lahaina, she watched ships arrive from the farthest corners of the world. Whaling vessels, traders, explorers. Each brought something new. Languages, diseases, gods, dreams. And still she ruled, her mind sharp as coral, her heart anchored in the islands she had remade. When she died, the kingdom mourned not only a queen, but an age. The world she had inherited was gone, and the one she left behind was uncertain, a place between memory and modernity. But her name remained, carved into every decision that followed. The abolition of the Kapu, the rise of written law, the first constitution, the education of women, the redefinition of power itself. In time, statues would stand where temples once stood. Church bells would echo where chants had once called to the gods. And through it all, Kaʻahumanu's shadow stretched quietly, not as a ghost but as a question. What does it mean to rule when faith, tradition, and destiny collide? Her story is not merely the story of a queen. It is the story of Hawaii's transformation, from the world of gods to the world of nations. And somewhere between those two worlds, she still stands, half remembered, wholly unforgotten. Stay with the story. Watch the next film in our Hawaiʻi arc and tell us your theory in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Facts first, mystery intact. At dusk, the wind over Maui carries a sound that is neither chant nor hymn, a whisper between worlds. It is said that if you listen long enough, you can still hear her name in the rustle of the palms. Kaʻahumanu. Her story does not end with her death, because her shadow still lies across the islands, in the laws, the language, the silence between tides. Every choice she made carved a new shape into Hawaii's heart. Every silence she kept became a boundary between what was sacred and what was lost. The missionaries she once welcomed would go on to reshape the kingdom. Their books would become the kingdom's laws, their prayers its public voice. And yet, behind every sermon and statute, her presence lingers, the queen who saw change coming and dared to guide it. History often forgets those who stand between ages. It prefers heroes and villains, conquerors and saints. Kaʻahumanu was none of these, and all of them. Her power was not in battle, but in vision. Not in conquest, but in consequence. Today the temples are ruins, the palaces turn to museums. But the question she left behind still echoes. Can a nation change its gods and still remain itself? Perhaps that is why her name endures. Not as a legend frozen in stone, but as a living pulse beneath the soil of Hawaii, where the old world and the new still meet, and where somewhere between them, a queen still rules the wind. Mahalo nui loa I nā kupuna o Hawaii. Great thanks to the ancestors of Hawaii, whose wisdom still moves through the waves, the mountains, and the hearts of those who listen.
E nā pāli ki ka hae, ala I ka malamalama o ke kakahiaka, e ka makani o ka iaulu.
E ka la e hala wai ana me ke kai, e malamalama I ko maua ala.